Today we're going to discuss wool, and I wanted to skip ahead to the fiber section of the book, which is the very last section. It starts on page 539, and I couldn't think about starting the whole process about technique and everything like that without first discussing the reason that we all knit, or the material that we all knit with. So I started to delve into the fiber section, and it also was fitting because I just attended the Rhinebeck Sheep and Wool Festival, or the New York Sheep and Wool Festival in Rhinebeck, New York. And I'm going to share some footage with you at the end of this little snippet on wool. So it made sense to discuss the raw materials that we all, know and love, and what we work with all the time. I want to first stress that this is not meant to be a video version of June's book. I think you should absolutely read it and read it and delve in. There's so much information, and I'm not going to summarize everything. I'm just going to touch on things that I found interesting. There will be a blog post if you would like to read my more coherent notes on all of this. That will be linked down below. And right now I'm just going to discuss some things that I just found interesting. I only got up to page 543. That was just in the wool section alone. Rather than make a 25-minute video, I'm just going to stick to wool today. So June begins by outlining the major categories of fiber that we kind of all know and love, things that we'll find at our local yarn store. The first being protein fibers, the most common. So anything from an animal, basically a sheep, a camelid like an alpaca or llama or camel, and then things like silkworms are also in this category, possum, things that are kind of smaller and less common are also included in the keratin category. So these are all made from proteins that also make up human hair and nails, so keratin. The second category is vegetable protein, or vegetable fiber, flax, ramie, hemp, linen, bast fibers like that, and cotton, of course. These are all things that are derived from plants and are completely vegan, okay for vegans to use and knit with. They're also wonderful in their own ways. They have wonderful qualities that we'll talk about later. There's also regenerated fibers, things that are maybe natural but treated with chemicals, things like cellulosic fibers like bamboos and rayons, things that are maybe broken down from wood pulp, treated with chemicals and then extruded sort of like through a pasta machine, and made into long fibrous fibers that you can make into yarns. They're kind of silk replacements. And I've also heard of things like, there's Tencel, which is a brand name for one of these types of fibers, and Cupro, which is actually a byproduct of cotton manufacturing. And they sort of act like silk. They're very flowy, and again, we'll discuss those at length later. There's also synthetics, which are made from petrochemicals. This is your acrylic, your polyesters, your nylons. Not the most, eco-friendly fibers, but they have their own charms. We'll discuss that in a minute. Metallics also sort of fall into this category, and they bring either sparkle or stretch or resiliency or washability. They all have something, a reason for being. Sometimes they're just meant to try to knock off the properties of wool, which unfortunately they don't. Science has really tried hard to replicate what wool can do naturally, and unfortunately they haven't been able to do it. I think it's kind of a testament to how amazing wool is, and the closest they've gotten is things like polar fleece, which are still not as temperature regulating and moisture regulating and all those things that we love wool for. The elasticity that it has, the memory, all of those qualities are things that have not been able to be replicated by science. But synthetic materials like Lycra, they kind of can bring a little bit of that to the table. One fact I found really interesting was that regenerated fiber, which I've also heard called garnetted, where old fiber, old yarn, old sweaters even are kind of chopped up and made into a sort of mush and then made into new yarn. That is obviously a cost-effective way of working, but the quality of the wool that comes out of this is not so great. It can be a little harsh because of the cut ends, or it can be weaker because it's already been processed once and maybe even worn. So, but that's actually called shoddy, and this is not a term that I've heard very often. But I have heard the word, but not applied to wool. And something I learned from June's book was that rag, or what I know as marl or rag, this kind of two-tone look where you have one strand that's one color and then another contrasting one, that used to be made with one strand of shoddy and then another new strand of woolen virgin fiber. So I thought that was pretty cool. I don't think that modern marls often use that approach, but it was a nice way of sort of stretching an old, maybe less, an inferior quality fiber. So June definitely supports using the best you can afford, and I have to agree. I'm biased, of course, working with amazing luxury yarns, but if you can, this reminds me of something that Kat Bordy also says, which is that if you can't afford the best materials, save up, eat beans and rice for a week and then splurge on those amazing materials, because your work takes time and effort and you should treat yourself to the very best. June also believes it's a form of tithing, and it's going to keep people in business that are making the amazing fibers we love so much. So it is an expense, but it's one that's well worthwhile. So the Wool Products Labeling Act of the United States Federal Trade Commission calls wool anything that comes from a fiber-producing animal like sheep, lamb, angora, goats, cashmere goats, camels, alpacas, llamas, and vicunas. And some people around the world call wool, anything that you knit with, they call wool. That's a bit confusing, and in Principles of Knitting, June is going to refer to wool only when she means sheep's wool. That's kind of how I use it as well. She calls anything else kind of specialty wool, and I will just call it what it is: alpaca, llama, whatever I'm knitting with. If you want to know more about sheep breeds, I highly recommend Clara Parks's Book of Wool, and she also has a book called Book of Yarn. It will help you learn about breeds and all the qualities. They're very different. It's a huge world. Obviously it can fill many books, so it's really interesting. Going to Rhinebeck, you get to see a lot of them up close, and you really can see the differences in the fleeces and then what it ends up in. The finished products are all very, very different. Merino sheep are considered one of the highest qualities, and that means that the micron count is pretty low. It has a very soft, fine fiber, and it also has a really nice crimp, and it just forms amazing yarn. And all of the Zealana wool blends have merino sheep in them. A really cool factoid from June's book was that Queen Elizabeth I won some merino sheep from the Spanish Armada, and that win, that score, sort of set off the British wool industry. So all of the sheep that ended up in Australia and New Zealand are descended from this win. So I thought that was pretty cool. That means Zealana may have royal lineage. The best grades of wool are often kept in penned enclosures, and they sometimes will even put they'll put little dresses on them, which is really funny because they can be floral print. I've seen that at Rhinebeck. I've seen just plain ones, but it's always really funny to happen upon a sheep wearing a pretty floral dress. The thing that makes wool so incredible is its structure. So the outer layer is called the epicuticle, and this is a thin, water-resistant membrane. And underneath that, there are scales that are similar to the scales you find on human hair. Underneath that, there's the cortex, and the cortex is filled with fibrils, which are spindle-shaped little tendrils, and they're cells that trap air and help it to be a lightweight. It's surprisingly warm and lightweight for the weight of it. So wool sweaters can be very, very light, but also be very, very insulating. And that's because of all the air that gets trapped between the tendrils and the scales and all of that. So sometimes you can get a superwash wool, and that's treated with a resin coating, and that will glue down the scales and help it from becoming matted. The matting is what you get when you felt something, if you've ever felt it, or when you see hair that's turned into dreadlocks. Same process. You're kind of lifting those scales with heat, and soap usually helps the process along, and then agitating them so that they interlock and form a dense mat. Felt is amazing. I've secretly always wanted to live in a yurt. If you've never been inside one, it's incredibly cozy and warm. It's just a really cool fiber. You can cut it and it doesn't unravel. Felt is incredible. But if you want to prevent felting, you need to treat it so that those little cuticles don't get entangled. And that often involves a process that either burns off those scales or glues them down. And gluing is temporary, and eventually the glue will come undone. So it's not truly permanently machine washable. It's just sort of a claim that just doesn't live up to the promise. You have to wash it with cold water. I also don't love the feeling, I knew this sort of before June explained it in the book, was that superwash wools feel very slick. They tend to feel very slippery and slinky, which is a nice quality. It makes it smooth to wear next to skin, but I don't particularly love it. It just doesn't feel like actual wool. It feels like there's a layer separating you, and that's because there's a resin glue holding down those scales. Eventually it'll come off, so it's not truly machine washable forever. So for all these reasons, June recommends just knitting with wool and treating it gently. So do I. So there is a misconception that wool is difficult to care for. It really isn't in the grand scheme of things, but it does require some attention. But people also avoid wool because they might feel that they're allergic. And there isn't a lot of medical evidence to support this. This is a very contentious issue. Elizabeth Zimmerman also has a lot to say about especially dressing babies in wool. And I've seen babies wearing wool in lots of different countries, and people avoid it here for whatever reason. I think it's often confused with irritation. So June calls it contact dermatitis, that is usually what people are experiencing, rather than it's an external response, sort of an itchy feeling and a localized redness, rather than an internal allergy where your nasal passages are closing up. Those are very rare. But irritation is by all means legitimate. If you don't like wearing wool next to your skin, you don't have to. Go for the softest blends that you can find, something maybe that's blended with cotton. We have a yarn called kiwi that would work just fine, or layer something underneath it. So we've just scratched the surface of wool, and there's plenty more to learn about fiber and wool. There'll be more on the blog, and for now I'd like to take you to Rhinebeck. I want to share the fall color, the foliage, the junk food, the sheep, all the people milling around. It was just amazing. If you have the chance to get to something similar near you, definitely do it. It's just fun to be around that many people who get it, who understand, why you do what you do and why wool is so exciting. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you soon.